Hello, BookTube. I once again have a great Brattle book haul to show you, and it's great for the same reason. It was paid for by one of you. I, I cannot express my gratitude enough, and the only way I can think to do it is by making these kinds of videos to show you. Uh, Somebody gave me $10, and I got 9 books plus the usurious Massachusetts tax rate, so I made it go as far as possible. I thought I'd show them to you now. The first one is this, Art and Artor by Cynthia Ozick. We've seen on this channel before her latest book, which is a collection of book reviews and book essays. This is an older version, an older collection of book reviews and book essays. Always a treat. Then there's Elizabeth Hardwick's, this was the Penguin Lives series. I've mentioned it before. I mentioned it just the other day for Roy Blount's biography of the arch traitor Robert E. Lee. This is another one of the gems in that series. It's her biography of Herman Melville at 150 pages, and it's absolutely brilliant. I had an old friend who, at the time that this was coming out, was working on a gigantic biography of Melville, and I got this in the mail, and I read it and loved it, and I tried to bring it up to him, and he said, "Please tell me it's terrible." And I can understand why, since he spent hundreds of pages in almost 10 years. Nevertheless, I broke it to him gently. Next one is a Penguin classic. Always a treat to get a Penguin classic. This is Jona Obi, Childhood. It's a lightly fictionalized account of his time at Bergen-Belsen. And I'd never seen this Penguin classic before. I don't think I've ever read the book before. I was kind of surprised, too, that this is a Penguin classic that has no scholarly introduction. It has an afterword. But I guess the Penguin considered it, too slight and self-evident to need a scholarly introduction, or maybe there isn't much scholarship. But one way or another, it's some skinny books, but that won't stay true. Then I found this, a copy of a book I've sent to many of you by now, most of P.G. Woodhouse. This is a collection of all of the Woodhouse writings, and it had an airline ticket in it from Brussels to New York in 2008. So someone got this at an airport, got as far as Blanding's Castle, and then ditched it somewhere along the line. But I already have a couple of P.G. Woodhouse collections that I really like, so this one goes on the pile of things to give away. And then the next one was this, the Gun and the Olive Branch by David Hurst. This is a big study of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is a source of endless, although grim, fascination for me. And I have heard about this book, but I have never owned a copy. It's had a couple of different editions, and I was thrilled to find it. It's a section of my library that I go to often, especially since it's a perennial subject of interest for editors. They like to assign such books. And the next one, talk about an area of my library that I go to often. Look at this. A Time for Trumpets by Charles MacDonald. This is his classic, fantastic account of the Battle of the Bulge, in which the German army, penned further and further back by the advance of the Allies, decided on a make-or-break mad campaign to burst through and make a beachhead on the nearest strategically important river. A purely insane plan. It could not possibly have worked. It could only have been pushed through by a madman. And it led to some real hard fighting. The Allies were caught completely on the wrong hop and rolled back quite a ways, and before they regained their footing and just poured men and equipment into the bulge to push it back. There was a new book last year, I think, called Blood and Steel, about the Battle of the Bulge, and I loved it. But when I reviewed it, I referenced MacDonald's book all the time, and I realized at the time I don't have a copy of MacDonald's book. I got rid of it for some reason. And I remember at the time thinking, the Brattle will provide. But I had no idea that it would be paid for by somebody else. And don't you fret about the shape of this book. When I'm done rehabilitating it, it will be ironclad and good for another decade. And then there's this is an omnibus of the first 3 Black Company novels by Glenn Cook. Absolutely first-rate military fantasy. I had this one. I got a copy of this one. These have great cover illustrations by Raymond Swanlin. I think there are 4 of them or 3 of them. And I got set after set after set of them new at bookstores in order to give to people. Glenn Cook is a wonderful person to hand to somebody to read, especially although he would never have thought this. If you know a teenage boy that you would like to hook on reading, but who just isn't in the Pride and Prejudice mind frame, this will work. It will absolutely work, unless the teenage boy in question is a psychopath, which I guess we should mention as a possibility, right? Since statistically speaking, so many of them are. But if you have a sound penny who just hasn't been hooked by reading, this will do it. And then this, I read this. It's The Battle of the Wilderness by Gordon Ray, and I read this when it first came out. I think it was in the early 80s. No, 1994. This came out in 1994. I remember reading it and loving it, and thinking that I would hold on to it forever. And mine had annotations, and it disappeared. but I was overjoyed to find this again. It's a perfect hardcover. It's not mine. I checked. My annotations aren't in there. But I was overjoyed to find this. It's the story of the Battle of the Wilderness that took place in 1864 in the shadow of the Battle of Gettysburg, where it was increasingly becoming obvious that the Southern armies, especially the big army under General Lee, were all that stood between the Confederacy and destruction, and that they didn't stand between the Confederacy and destruction, that they had no chance. Outnumbered 2 or even sometimes 3 to 1 by the North, which also had an inexhaustible supply of material and manpower behind those numbers, whereas the South had at most 70,000 men and no equipment and no rail lines and no river supply lines and nothing to back it up. Basically, barefoot soldiers in threadbare uniforms living off the land and then fighting like hell whenever they encountered Union soldiers. And in the Battle of the Wilderness, they do. It's Lee versus General Grant. And General Grant was ably assisted by General Meade, who had been the man to beat Lee at Gettysburg. And I remember when I was reading this book, I loved it so much. It is so enjoyable, but I also loved it because it cuts Lee down to size as a military commander. It spares no blows at the massive mistakes that he makes all throughout the preparation to and the execution of the Battle of the Wilderness. And that was refreshing for me because I have been, like with George Washington and Napoleon Bonaparte, I have spent my whole life railing against these guys as military geniuses. I've spent my whole life pointing out that they factually, objectively were not. And it does no good at all. So the PR campaign just rolls on. And the same is true in spades about Lee. People love to talk about his unbeatability, about his genius on the battlefield. And this book shows what many Civil War histories don't show, which is that that's not true at all. It's true that when he came face to face with an enemy, even an enemy much larger than himself, he showed pugnaciousness. But it's not hard to show pugnaciousness when you've got a river at your back and the only alternative to pugnaciousness is to surrender. That's not actually hard to do. Lots of generals do that. It's this mystique that has surrounded him and that allowed him to survive when he should have been hanged from the highest branch of the tallest tree the minute the war was over. At Appomattox Courthouse, he should have signed the surrender papers with General Grant standing there, and instead of the two of them exchanging pleasantries over the dead bodies of tens of thousands of people, instead Grant should have said, "Glad to have your signature. Men, take him outside and behead him like a chicken." But that didn't happen. Instead, he got to retire in genteel respectability as a college professor. But this is first-rate narrative military history, and I found it again, but totally unlooked for. So, whoever you were, I have to thank you again and again for all this. This is just incredible. And I wanted to share it on camera, so I'll get back to normal in no time at all. But in the meantime, thank you, BookTube.